And good afternoon, and welcome to our webinar on building bridges through education, the institutional challenges of collaboration between American and Iranian universities. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. As many of you are aware, Basketball Institute's mission is to facilitate meaningful discussions on the topic of bridging cultural gaps between Americans and Iranians. And today's webinar will focus on education as the role and the key role it has played in building lasting relationships. Don't miss our next event in November. We will focus on the role of sports and wrestling in building bridges of friendship between Americans and Iranians. We will have a member of the International Olympic Committee and president of the United World Wrestling, Nenat Lalovich, who will speak about how Iranians and Americans collaborated to save wrestling from elimination in Olympics in 2013. So today, we have a distinguished guest, Dr. Amir Reza, Dean of the Babson Academy of Global Education. And Dr. Reza is a leading expert, as you have seen on his bio, on international education. And our moderator today is Professor Matt Shannon, whom many of you know. Matt was a former fellow at our institute. He's a great scholar of American Iranian history, and he will be moderating our session today. We are grateful to both Dr. Reza and Professor Shannon for their participation. We also want to thank our sponsors who have made this possible. And most important, we want to thank our project manager, Delara, who has been instrumental in making our programs possible for all of you. I hope this webinar will inspire you to think critically about how we can bridge gaps through education. Thank you for joining us today. And now I pass this to Matt, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bakhtiari, and thank you to Delara and everyone else with the Baskerville Institute. I have the pleasure today of introducing Dr. Amir Reza, who is the Dean of the Babson Academy for the Advancement of Global Entrepreneurial Learning. He is also Dean of Global Education, in which capacity he is responsible for the curricular and co-curricular internationalization of Babson College. He has worked at Babson in various leadership capacities for more than 2 decades, during which time Babson has received numerous distinguished awards. In 2018, Babson was a recipient of the Senator Paul Simon Comprehensive Internationalization Award issued by NAFSA. That same year, Forbes named Babson as the best school for international students in the United States. More recently, in 2022, Babson received the Andrew High School Award for Innovation in International Education from the Institute of International Education. Dr. Reza has held numerous leadership positions in the field of international education, including with NAFSA. He has served on the advisory boards of international universities spanning from Shanghai to Berlin, and he is currently the president-elect of the Association of International Education Administrators. In his research, Dr. Reza focuses on internationalization of higher ed, intercultural competency, and global administration and entrepreneurship. He has numerous publications, including being the co-author of a book published by NAFSA in 2019, titled Careers in International Education, A Guide for New Professions. Today, Amir Reza will deliver a lecture titled Building Bridges Through Education, the Institutional Challenges of Collaboration between American and Iranian universities. With that, I present you Dr. Reza. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Professor Shannon, for that kind introduction. And I think all those accolades already belong to my team here at Babson, not just me. I really appreciate it. Greetings to you all, friends, Dustan. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's an honor to be asked by Dr. Bakhtiari and the Baskerville Institute to present to you on this topic of building bridges, as it resonates with me both personally and professionally, given that I benefited from international education exchange as a young person living and growing up on multiple continents, and then as a professional, seeing the power that international education can have in building bridges to build lasting friendships that overcome some of the deepest differences and challenges that we have in our world today. Am I able to share my screen at this point? Yes. Okay. Allow me to begin here by sharing with you an agenda for our conversation today. So, given the goals and objectives of this webinar, I wanted to begin with looking at what engagement looks like today between US and Iran in terms of universities, really looking at some of the context of internationalization in the United States. Some of that is historical data we should look at, and then some of the obstacles. And I want to bring a case study of US-Iran engagement, and then looking ahead in the future. I do have to share that some of this bias is that it is a US university and internationalization perspective. That is my expertise, so I want to acknowledge that as we move ahead. So when we look at a snapshot of today, international students from Iran only make up 1% of all international students in the United States. That has clearly not always been the case. We're going to review that and look at that in a moment. We also see a very limited set of formal university relationships between the US and Iran in terms of higher education. However, there are numerous individual-led collaborations. These are often not formal university relations. These could be faculty who have Iranian roots, maybe returning to Iran for lectures or programs, or individuals working together on collaborative research virtually and publications. Another important figure I think to think about in a snapshot today are Iranian visiting scholars in the United States. Again, they make up less than 2% of all international scholars in the United States, and I'll dig into that data in a moment. So in short, we don't have outbound mobility from the US to Iran that I could capture. This is the inbound mobility, and it's important to consider. When we look at these factors, I think it's important to consider why a country like Iran would have any kind of mobility with a nation like the United States. And I think if we consider Iran as the home country along these lists and the United States as the host country, these push-pull factors help us to put the historical data of Iranian students in the United States in context. Considering the different eras in Iran's history, there were significant push factors coupled with strong pull factors for the US. So many of these factors are still at play today, but the geopolitical landscape and high tuition costs create significant barriers in the post-revolution era for Iranians to access US higher education. But just to take a couple as an example, so if we think about the US as the host country, one of the things we know to be the case is that the United States very early on in the post-World War II era developed a complex infrastructure of higher education, and which led to it allowing more and more students to access that were college age some sort of tertiary education. And that was a development of community colleges, vocational schools, in addition to public universities, private schools such as liberal arts or standalone business schools like Babson, and the Ivy League and beyond. So that really created this strong pull factor, if you will, and capacity to absorb more and more international students into the US. On the other hand, you had push factors from Iran with scholarships available both from the US side and the Iranian government side. You had certainly a scarcity of capacity in Iranian universities in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And then obviously this huge enhanced marketplace value of foreign degree. As Professor Shannon's book actually has captured, many of those who obtained degrees in the United States returned to Iran in the 60s and 70s to take on key roles in government, in higher education, and in other sectors. So that cannot be understated, and it's important to put in context. So this next slide I want to share with you is related to the rise and fall, if you might imagine, of Iranian students in the United States. The Institute for International Education has, for over 7 decades, produced an Open Doors report, which captures outbound and inbound mobility from the United States, student mobility, that is. And so it helps us, and it's become more and more sophisticated over time to really help us analyze what is happening with regard to student mobility. There is a bit of a lag here. Did I lose? Again, here, what we want to focus on is this idea of the captured international student mobility into the United States. Going back to the 1950s, we see relatively small numbers, but then it quickly grows to this 51,000 figure in the 1979-80 academic year. Going back to 1950, we see that their key push-pull factors create significant and unprecedented student mobility growth from Iran to the US. So key historical events contribute to this. For instance, 1949, US and Iran established a bilateral cultural exchange commission. In 1953, post-coup, there's a forging of close alliances between Iran and the US. In 1960, for instance, University of Pennsylvania helps develop Pahlavi University as a blueprint for US modeled modernization of Iranian higher education. Again, a strong appetite to access US higher education. And of course, the 1960s and 70s experienced government-supported and private funded outbound mobility. And so when we think about this 51,000 in the terms of today, it really is staggering. And we might examine that in the context of a percentage as well, which I'll share in a moment. You see a huge drop after 1980, and for the past decades, it has been relatively low. And so as a percentage, as you can see, what I want to emphasize here is this represents what percentage of the total international student enrollment in the United States were made up of Iranians. The fact that 1 out of 5, roughly, international students in the United States were from Iran in this 1979-1980 academic year is important in itself. But considering that Iran at the time had a population of roughly 37 million, really puts that in context. By today's standards, we have countries like China at 1.3 billion, whose students make up about 25% of international students in the United States. So it really tells you that volume demand, that push and pull factors that drew Iranian students into the United States. Another important cohort, although the data does not go as far back, that we should consider are visiting scholars from Iran in the US. There are university researchers, scholars, and faculty who spend time at US universities for a relatively short duration on a visa called J1. They often return home to their home country with renewed perspective on their host country and new ideas for pedagogy and research, coupled with long-standing friendships, which can blossom into ongoing partnerships, of course. Scholars from Iran make up less than 1% of total international visiting scholars in the US until 2012. That number does not rise above 1.5% until that academic year, as you can see, 2011, 2012. And the biggest percentage change from year to year was in the 2011, 2012, or 2010, 2011 to 2011, 2012, when the numbers of scholars jumped approximately 42%, in percentage terms high, but in raw terms, not that significant. This is likely related to some visa restrictions being eased, going from a single entry to a multiple entry, which eases travel for international conferences, conducting research, returning home periodically. But still today, as we can see here, the numbers are relatively limited. So going beyond this mobility, I think it's important to consider US-Iran university partnership in the context of internationalization. So if we understand the motivations for US universities to internationalize, we're then better equipped to perhaps analyze why or why not would Iranian and US universities want to engage with one another in the near future, and how that informs the landscapes today. Internationalization is widely viewed as higher education's response to globalization. Universities, however, are idiosyncratic. What works for a small institution that's selective, that is in the Northeast United States, let's say like Babson College here in Massachusetts, is not going to work for a large public land grant university in terms of internationalization. Therefore, scholars have shared different ways and rationales as to why universities internationalize. And I thought it would be important in these slides for us to review some of that. Certainly more and more as we see state funding being on a decline, public funding for higher education. Revenue generation is a critical piece, workforce development, absolutely. And I think there are certainly more virtuous rationales such as intercultural learning, access to more and more students from a diverse backgrounds. Institutional reputations and rankings have certainly become more and more important in recent years, and we need to consider that. I think it's important for us to think about this. As you can see from the list here, universities tend to not focus on one nation or any particular nation for internationalization, and Iran is no exception. However, they are motivated by their objectives, which are often not aligned with engagement with Iran, because competing demands and interests pave the way for them to quickly and more easily establish relationships with higher education institutions in other nations. Historical paths continue to be reinforced with connections to Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and to a lesser extent, East Asia and the Americas, and of course, lesser extent in the Middle East and the MENA region, I should say, Africa and Iran in particular. So now that we've discussed the why, I think it's also important to think about some of the prioritization that boards, presidents, and others think about. So the American Council on Education does a mapping of internationalization on US campuses every 5 years, where they ask provosts across the country to consider a survey that helps them analyze and understand what are the motivations and the prioritization for internationalization. As we can see from this slide, to improve student preparedness for a global era is a critical piece, and it's important to consider in all of this. This is another way to look at the data, and I think it's really critical and interesting that there are a couple of points I want to make out of this slide. Is that institutional prioritization during the pandemic meant that partnerships with institutions and organizations abroad got a lift. Perhaps there was an opportunity for these institutions, as you can see in the blue column here, during the pandemic, to have a broader imagination and focus less on student mobility, because student mobility was hugely hampered by the pandemic. So they were focusing more on this. However, the challenge then becomes when we look at the mapping data and ask those same provosts and leaders, what about the future priorities that you have? And as you can see here, again, recruiting international students takes priority here. It has consistently been so since 2016, but really grows. And lower priority for partnerships, which is important to keep in mind if we're examining US-Iran institutional collaboration. So going from there, I think we also need to consider that internationalization is not always the priority for boards and presidents. There are many competing demands for their time, attention, and budgetary constraints. Universities must internationalize to address a globalized world, but there are many headwinds. You can see here, especially in public universities, there's much local demands. In fact, sometimes at institutions, public universities, I've heard that the state has quotas on what percentage of international students may be enrolled in certain programs, especially undergraduate degree. There's definitely limited funding. There's increased risks associated with internationalization, whether that is because of the pandemic, conflict, reputational, any number of pieces. And then I think this is a really key piece. The US, as a share of international students across the globe, has been losing its share, even though it's still a leading nation, in that while the pull factors continue to be strong, a lack of national policy vis-a-vis internationalization hurts, I think, higher education internationalization at large, where we see nations like Canada, UK, Australia have national policies that thoroughly support that. In the US, it is very much left up at the local, state, and often just institutional level. And of course, we know that federal and state policies limiting international engagement are really problematic, especially vis-a-vis Iran. In fact, some stakeholders have shared with me that in states like Florida, there are bans about engagement with Iran that go beyond what the federal rules are. And then finally, this decline in language learning across the US is also not helpful. As a whole, what we see here is that internationalization is a mixed bag for US institutions of higher education, where we see that well-resourced institutions are thriving on internationalization. It helps them generate revenues, bring in a really diverse set of students from all over the world, which creates more funding, which helps them gain higher rankings and move more and more to the center, while others have to find creative ways to overcome these challenges as they continue to internationalize. While it has been really difficult to find cases in which Iran and US have had strong university relations in recent years, I want to share a case study of success here, but also comes with some caveats. So what I learned is that Indiana University, Purdue University in Annapolis was the first US institution of higher education to form a formal MOU with an institution in Iran since the revolution, 1979 revolution, and that is with the University of Tehran. It seems that the first formal MOU after the revolution was in 2002. However, it was not till 7 years later where they were able to actually put some activities into place with regard to the MOU. In 2009, there was a 6-year dual degree program established, 2 undergraduate years at the University of Tehran's Faculty of Engineering and 4 years at IUPUI School of Engineering. That has now later transformed, it seems, to a 1 + 1.5 program for a master's degree. And the future of it is a bit uncertain from what I understand. What I can tell you is that when I interviewed the retired senior international officer from IUPUI who really championed this at IUPUI, she shared with me that this took many, many years to develop given the complex US-Iran relations. It was really only made possible after 3+, maybe perhaps 3.5 years of ongoing negotiations, receiving OFAC clearances, institutional approvals, and then on the Iran side, similarly. But what is clear is that what made this relationship possible was the resilient individuals on both sides with strong affinity for Iran and the US. In other words, on the IUPUI side, you see either senior administrators such as deans, senior faculty, and a senior international officer who was really felt like a moral obligation to bring this to fruition. despite the many challenges. And on the Iran side, you see faculty who had spent time in the United States, and as they see that their careers are coming to an end, they want their students who will then take the helms of higher education from them in the future to have the opportunity to experience US higher education. So it's clear from this case study that while this is a fruitful and successful endeavor ultimately, it is not easily scalable. For instance, I asked the senior international officer, I mentioned that, you and I know that, within a few weeks, we can establish such an MOU and a dual degree program with institutions of higher education in a place like Sweden or Greece. And so why spend the time for 3.5 years to try to establish this with Iran? And again, what she responded is, when we think about it as a whole across the US, many people would shy away from such an endeavor, but the stars had to align and the different individuals really pushed for this over the many, many years through their resilience. So when we think about all of this, I want to share a little bit about the patterns that I observed that I think will help us in shaping kind of what maybe some of the recommendations going forward. Now, I reached out to about 1,000 members of the Association of International Education Administrators. This is an association for senior international officers across the globe. Many of them are in the United States. And out of that 1,000 I received, and what I asked is, I would like to know any formal relationships that your institutions has had with Iranian institutions of higher education in the past, let's say 20 years. And I received only about a dozen replies or less. And most of them indicated, and the patterns are observed, there's a very low level of engagement, if at all. The formal relationship required key stakeholders with personal and historical affinity with Iran, and a lot of stars to align at the institutional level. And mostly the engagements seem to be scholarly at the individual level rather than institutional level. As I mentioned, Iranian scholars or Iranian American faculty returning home to give lectures or providing opportunities now virtually to provide lectures and engagement and collaborative research opportunities. So finally, it's true that I think there's a lot of complexity to navigate, obtaining approvals, whether it's institutional or ORFAC, for these type of formal relationships. Prioritization of other regions and nations works against us, I believe. And then this dynamic geopolitical landscape works against US-Iran university engagements. So as we look ahead, I think difficult US-Iran relations will continue to hamper robust Iran and US student scholar mobility and formal in-person university learning, that's for sure. On the other hand, the silver lining that I saw as I analyzed this is that the COVID pandemic required all of us, whether we're in Iran, but especially in the US, require us to invest heavily and have more receptivity and develop virtual learning that now spans time zones and national boundaries that is actually of quite high quality. And even our learners have become much more adept and receptive to virtual learning. I think the heightened attention to virtual global learning aligns with many universities' missions to increase access to engage learners across the globe and practice sustainability, given that there's no global travel and carbon footprint. And in particular, a methodology called COIL, Cooperative Online International Learning, although it's not new, but has gained momentum since the pandemic, is a pedagogy that can overcome mobility and in-person US-Iran institutional engagement challenges, in my opinion. Just to be specific, as you can see here, what we have is the COIL methodology is quite simple, although I think quite robust. So course A is offered by institution B in X location in the United States, let's say. course X is offered in institution Y in Iran. They could be in different languages. They could be the same or different disciplines. And what this requires, I believe, are three types of actors. One is instructional technology from a university, two faculty members who will engage, and then an international office who can administer the program. And it really provides the students the space to work together on projects and discussions in the middle of the semester. And there are no institutional barriers in that credit is given to course A for those students at that institution B, and credit is given for course X at institution Y. So it really does remove a lot of these barriers. And I think in general, online global learning has so many benefits: greater access for students, learners, no matter where they are in the world, lower carbon footprint. I do think that it's certainly cost effective, and there's so much more. And I don't want to go into this exhaustive list, as I want to kind of conclude here to leave us some time for Q&A and discussion. Again, to conclude, I think in the foreseeable future, academic mobility between Iran and the US will continue to be very limited, as we saw in the Open Doors report. I think that US-Iran institutions have an opportunity to explore virtual global learning that transcends geopolitical differences and national boundaries while building strong foundations of engagement, friendship, and learning that aligns with their institutional mission and serves their respective communities. And then another path that I think I did not discuss in depth here, but happy to get into, is engagement of the two sides through multilateral organizations. The Global Entrepreneurship Monitor is an example we can go into, where the Association of Asia Pacific Association of International Education, European Association of International Education, and the Babson Collaborative are examples that I could think of that could be this multilateral approach of engagement between Iran and the US while overcoming some of those challenges that I outlined. I want to end with a reminder that education can be a powerful bridge, as I shared at the beginning. I love to share this quote by a world-renowned interculturalist, Milton Bennett. Oh. I'm going to stop sharing so we can. And the quote, essentially, if you had a chance to read it, is that international education professionals are quiet revolutionaries in the history of human interaction. I think their work is important in building bridges that have the potential to shape our future. I'll stop there and happy to ask Professor Shannon to comment and Q&A.
Thank you very much for that comprehensive overview, and for the fact that you stuck to your time limit and shared so much information with our member. And Matt will take the questions, and we look forward to having a good discussion on some of the important issues that you raised. Matt?
Thank you very much, Dr. Reza, for the lecture and presentation. There were some wonderful visuals with lots of valuable data there for all of us to think about. We currently have two questions, which I will ask. They're both from Lawrence Wilkerson. The first question is about to what extent is the visa acquisition and renewal process an impediment to Iranian students wanting to come to American universities? And the second question deals with exchanges between Iranian institutions and American ones with Iranian studies centers. And the question is specifically about the Farzaneh Family Center at Oklahoma University, but perhaps there would be kind of other examples that you'd have in mind. Are there meaningful exchanges between Iranian institutions and American ones with Iranian studies centers?
So on the second one, I don't have a lot of data information. As I mentioned, I tried to outreach to senior international officer, took that approach to see if there were formal institutional relationships that would include those. And none were mentioned or popped up in their research, but certainly I do think that, again, there are champions within institutions that are working the channels, but do they rise to that formal level of MOU and a formal relationship? It does not seem so. On the visa side, absolutely, of course, if you think about the process that Iranians have to go through to arrive in the United States, it is an incredible uphill task, where while in university students from almost anywhere in the world can go to their capital city, sometimes not even to their consulate very close to their home, and readily apply for visas. Iranian students, even if they're able to obtain the I-20 from the United States and are able to then provide evidence that they have the financial ability to afford the high-level tuitions in the United States, they have to, of course, travel to a third country just to be able to request the visa. And often those countries require a visa for Iranian students. And then oftentimes there's a waiting period. So all of this creates barriers and discouragement. And as I said, there's still, I mean, the fact that we still have nearly 10,000 Iranian students in the US is a testament to their interest, their resilience to want a US higher education. And I strongly believe, as it was proven by that rise and fall, if these impediments were not in place, we would see Iran in the top 10 countries represented in their international student mobility in the US.
We thank you very much for those answers. We have a question from James Good wondering about specific examples of institutions that have employed COIL in recent years.
Yeah, I think so. Florida International University, SUNY, those are two leaders in this space. The Association of American Colleges and Universities, coupled with Norwegian Directorate and a Japanese organization, this past year put a cohort of about 50 faculty and administrators, including myself, through a process by which we are to imagine COIL programs with Norwegian institutions, Japanese institutions of higher education, and begin to lay the groundwork so that, at least in my vision, in 5 to 10 years' time, I want every faculty at Babson to be familiar with COIL, both pedagogically, how it works, but also have the infrastructure so that you can raise your hand and say, I want to do a COIL because I have a connection with a professor at University of Esfahan. And so how do we go about doing that is it becomes kind of almost mundane. And so the idea here is that there are multiple organizations who are trying to help faculty understand that this is not a huge heavy lift. It is a lift, but if you have the interest, you have the connection, there are multiple stakeholders within your institution, including instructional technology, that can help you put into place. One of the things that I want to emphasize about COIL is that when you learn about the pedagogy of COIL, it is emphasized that you want to spend a third of the time on the people-to-people connection, right? That the students from the two institutions need to really get to know each other, understand each other, become comfortable with each other before you even introduce a project. Because if we introduce a project, it becomes task-oriented. You check a box, I've done a COIL. Where we want to really establish, the goal of COIL is to try to create the same global learning objectives that you would have if I were to travel to Norway, if I were to travel to China. Those same learning objectives, although it's not a replacement for travel to China, those same learning objectives for global learning can be achieved, at least to some extent, through COIL. And I think we are seeing more and more scholars research this to see, is it possible for us to achieve those human connections, the intercultural competence, the language learning that can be achieved in immersion programs? And some of that data shows at least some of this, if it's designed well, it can. So just to give you a concrete example, so in January, we'll be launching a course with a Nord University at Babson. Students are in different classes, but they'll be working together and they'll earn a badge, a digital badge for COIL.
Just to follow up on that question, John Salamak asks about, well, he notes that there's mounting evidence that virtual education does not always equal in-person education as far as quality and results. Mm-hmm. And if that is the case, is the virtual direction still the way to go? So my answer would be, it's not an or, but it's an and. So in other words, if you saw on one of the slides I shared, is that sometimes a virtual global learning opportunity primes learners to then want to go abroad. Other times, in this case, like in an Iran-US context, or even in the pandemic context, is it better to have nothing because you can't have mobility? Or does virtual global learning achieve some of those goals? Now, I would counter that virtual global learning done well can achieve many, but not all goals, right? If it's designed well and implemented well, it can achieve many goals. But of course, there's no replacement, and I'm a big proponent of it. I ask every Babson student to go abroad if they can, of being in person, being with people, creating those relationships, being able to smell, touch, feel that environment, and coming home understanding that you are now part of that environment, part of that community, and they're a part of you. Those build much, I think, stronger, lasting relationships. But in the absence of opportunity to do so, I do think virtual global learning can be a primer. We have a few additional questions. One from Colin Flint asking about whether the visa application process is any easier for Iranian postdoc scholars or faculty when compared to, say, undergraduate students.
If I had the answer to that, I think I could charge people, but I honestly don't, because the maze that the State Department creates around the visas is quite complex. And there are many unknowns, to be honest, right? So I know that, for instance, the ways in which IUPUI and University of Tehran formalized the relationship and involved the Department of State allowed batch processing of the cohort for the dual degree. That facilitates certainly a high degree of approval of visas vis-a-vis the individual going on their own. But I have not seen any evidence that postdocs versus others are receiving a higher level of, although, as you saw there, the J1 visa category, which is often the postdoc, does seem to have some sticking power. If you look at since 2000, those numbers have moderately grown and they haven't gone down. Part of that, honestly, is actually what we call intent to return. So with the J1 category, there's a requirement often for individuals to have to return, so they cannot have immigrant intent. Neither can F1, but oftentimes it's a pathway to go to H1B and permanent residency. With a J1, you cannot have that. So that could be one of the reasons why there's more success there, because they do need to return. And perhaps they even have more reasons to return to Iran, because there are faculty or researchers who have secure roles and opportunities and families to return to.
Yeah, thank you for that. Daniel Adams asks about the United Nations, whether you have done any work with the UN during your career in international ed, or perhaps also if the United Nations has any type of role to play in the larger process.
Yeah, I mean, the United Nations certainly has an opportunity. I think I have not worked with the United Nations in any particular way. I think if we think about the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right, the 17 goals, they are ripe for the UN to support through a higher education lens to assess, to troubleshoot, to ideate, to come up with solutions, and our learners, whether they're in Iran, in the US, collaborative solution and ideation around these large-scale problems, like let's say climate change or water. It is not something that you solve through a US lens or an Iran lens, but through a global community. And I think there are opportunities there that could pave the way for more engagement at the university level. You have all of the, I think, ingredients. You have the scholars, you have the scientists, you have the facilities, you have the learners of the future, and leaders of the future. So why not? But I'm not familiar with any particular initiative, other than I do think institutions like Babson, we're taking it upon ourselves to think about UN Sustainable Development Goals and how it relates to our mission as a higher education institution that is focused on entrepreneurship or entrepreneurial leadership.
Dr. Bakhtiari, do you have anything you'd like to ask before we continue on through the additional questions? Or
I'd like to ask a question about, we've talked about institutional arrangements a lot, and how about non-institutional interactions? I frequently get a lot of emails from Iranian students asking me questions about what Utah universities are offering, how they can connect. So I noticed that traffic of communications from Iran independent by students who are inquiring on their own how they can get acceptance at universities in the US. Have your colleagues talked to you about such communications? I mean, is this something that we are witnessing here also happening in other parts of the country?
So we do certainly hear, and my colleagues hear directly from students in Iran in a very informal way, requiring or requesting information about pathways to a US degree. Generally, what they're interested in is how do I pursue my degree, and what are the pathways, and how can I secure a visa, and are there scholarships and opportunities? But I think there's this larger point that I think maybe Professor Shannon can speak to it. In a different era, we had, an Iranian student association that really took on that responsibility, that was within higher ed, but it was quasi higher ed, right? It was not sanctioned by any one university, but it was nationwide. We really think about like an organization that's nationwide, focused to support Iranian students, but also to think about these pathways. And that I have not seen anything like that in this era. If we turn back to I think it was the 60s and 70s in your book, Professor Shannon, that we had the Iranian Student Association that really came together and really thought about the needs of Iranian students in the United States. But I'm not familiar with anything like that today.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because there were just so many organizations in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that were promoting educational ties between the United States and Iran. Even if we don't think about government programs such as Fulbright in the US or Iranian government scholarships in Iran, there were groups like the Ford Foundation and especially the American Friends of the Middle East, which was instrumental in sponsoring the creation of the Iranian Student Association in 1953. I don't know that such organizations exist, at least in such high numbers today when compared to that earlier era, but there were certainly many hands on deck. I was just reviewing some old sources before this lecture, and there's an American Council on Education report in the mid-1970s about institutional linkages between American and Iranian institutions. And there were maybe around 60 in 1976 compared to the one that you mentioned in the 21st century. So again, it's just kind of striking to see the transformation of those data points over time, but it would be nice if we had a revival of some of these perhaps older practices to help students find pathways to the US today. There are a couple additional questions coming in, and we really appreciate your time fielding all of them from our very engaged audience. One from Charles Kaminsky. He's asking about language skills. How do we handle the question of language skills from both sides, the United States and Iran, particularly when we're considering, engineering and other technical fields at a very high level?
Yeah, absolutely. So it seems to me, from either engaging with Iranian students myself or across the board at conferences, the thresholds through TOEFL and other tests that are required for students to receive admission into US institutions tend to be sufficient. I have not heard any complaints or issues with the IUPUI program with University of Tehran or others where faculty and others have complained or are concerned that the English level of Iranian students is not at par. And in fact, this is a phenomenon worldwide. We're seeing more and more of those technical courses taught in English, even in places like China, right? That was not likely, right? And just maybe 15, 20 years ago. So English has really become dominant as that language of science and technology and medicine. And so I think that many of these learners are already exposed to English from a very young age in Iran. Now, of course, the reverse is not true. We see that language learning in the US is on the decline as a whole. And to be frank, when I travel quite a bit. I also see that we become more and more lazy because we expect that no matter where we go in the world, we're going to conduct our business in English. So there's less motivation for us to go out there and learn, although I believe that it's critical to our global learning and understanding.
Thank you very much. David Woodward asks, short of direct working partnerships at the higher ed level, as well as conferences that are often based in the United States, what are some other association meetings globally, which could be productive meeting places for professionals from Iran and the United States?
Absolutely. Thank you, David, and great to hear from you. I know we've been connected through NAFSA and other ways for many years. I appreciate you being here. And I think you know as well as I do, as I mentioned towards the end of the slides, I think a multilateral approach, as you suggest, might actually be a really good way. So, for instance, there's the association, Asian Pacific Association of International Education, which convenes largely universities in the Asia Pacific region, but draws also many US American senior international officers and international educators. Could be a fruitful. EAIE is the European version of that. I, in particular, singled out two that I'm very familiar with. So one is the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. This is the largest database of entrepreneurship across the world. It was founded 23 years ago by London Business School and Babson College. And for 17 years, scholars at University of Tehran have been working on research and essentially contributing to this monitor. And so again, they're part of this global community that includes the US and the University of Tehran and multiple stakeholders from the US side. We have today a collaborative called the Babson Collaborative for the Advancement of Entrepreneurship. And it has 40 members in 27 countries. And I foresee a day in which we could welcome an Iranian university into such a collaborative. Again, what that presents, I think, is a multilateral approach to our work through a specific discipline that builds bridges. It certainly puts US and Iranian institutions in play and into contact, but it's not necessarily a bilateral relationship, which sometimes has its challenges, as we discussed.
Daniel Adams asks about particular subjects that draw Iranian students to the United States? That engineering was mentioned. Is that the most popular? Are there others?
Certainly, engineering, in a wide array of engineering fields, but we also see them across the STEM field, I would say. So I would go beyond engineering, so science, technology, engineering, math, and to a lesser extent, we are seeing some business, but I would say medicine for the healthcare professions. And I know Professor Bakhtiari, I think the Baskerville Institute had done some research in this area to see what fields they were interested in. Does that correspond with what you learned?
Yes, we did some research on student interest. If they were come to US, what field would they pursue, undergraduate and graduate? I think public health came number one. And within public health, I think Iranians have some other components. The multidisciplinary is a multilateral field, as you know. They were interested in post-COVID management issues. They were interested in resources, domestic, international. So that could be the byproduct of the COVID that you apparently mentioned. Another area that I think they have expressed interest, surprisingly, has not been from engineering and sciences, because somehow those students have strong connections within the universities already. And so we have received inquiries on history, languages. Again, language was very important for them, but also they were interested in kind of pursuing kind of short-term studies. They're wondering if they apply for a short-term visa, that like a study abroad, American student going there, if they come here for that, would that be easier in terms of visa and process? So those are some of the inquiries that we are getting, which kind of fits most of the information that you discussed. So the only question is how best to implement that, I think, which I like your idea of the multilateral approach. So that seems to be also acceptable to many international education experts. I think David right now is involved with Seattle University. You are with Babson, and we have several other people who are involved, and they could probably give a more detailed opinion on this topic.
Absolutely. On the short-term piece, again, the way that would work is it has to be at the institutional level that those exchanges are established to allow those students to then come for just one semester, as opposed to the students initiating on their own, because it is not so feasible related to a number of reasons, both immigration related, visa, and financial and otherwise. It is not so easy to admit students for just a temporary period, unless you have a formal exchange, which we do, most institutions do. And then you can certainly facilitate that through the J1 visa category.
We have two additional questions that just came in through the chat. One participant, whose name I don't see, asks about the feasibility, how feasible is it for Iranians to sign up for, I think they mean online classes, considering the political atmosphere and also internet connectivity problems. And Vicky Shemi asks a question about percentages of Iranian students who study in the United States. Do we know how many return to Iran versus how many stay in the United States after their education?
Yeah, I actually dug for that data, and it's not really easy to find, because the pathway from the F1 onto what they call optional practical training, and then on, what happens is institutions then lose that ability to report out what percentage of students decided to stay on, what percentage return of their alumni to their respective countries, which percentage went on to do perhaps go to a third country or do work authorization through the H-1B and permanent residency. So we would have to be guessing at those numbers. And I suspect that historically, many don't go back, me being one of them, right? If you can't beat them, you join them. That's the maxi, right? Yeah. So no, I think a lot of them find, and I think that's the pull in the United States overall for all international students, an opportunity to contribute, to stay, to have an opportunity that surpasses what you might have by returning home, especially with the skills you have gained, and opportunities perhaps being quite limited if you return home. So I would venture a guess that many of them do not go back. And then there was another part to the question.
There was another question from a different participant about whether or not it's feasible for Iranians to sign up for online coursework in the United States, given the political atmosphere and potential internet problems.
In my experience, it varies because, as we know, the internet is not consistently hampered and monitored. And then there are open enrollment programs in which faculty and students in Iran can certainly register for. Participate in a webinar such as this. There's no reason why Iranian, in fact, we hopefully have Iranian faculty and students participating today. And by and large, many people have decent internet service. Now, it's not inexpensive, it's not widely available perhaps, but so there's that feasibility. But I do think that there are times in which some of these programs require tuition and registration. And so that transaction is where the challenge comes in, right? So how can an Iranian in Iran pay, even if it was a nominal fee of a program that's like $150, how do they pay for that transaction so that they can enroll in an online program? And that becomes a problem very quickly. Unless I think that the way to think about that is, are there ways to sponsor, right? To find sponsorships on the US side, where we think about faculty development programs for Iranian faculty that's sponsored by an organization and then delivered through an online mechanism, and Iranians participate, but they don't have to actually go through a transaction where they're paying, but they're registering for it. That has been successful actually for us. We received a grant last year, and we did one, not in Iran, but it was teaching entrepreneurial mindset for the MENA region. And we received full funding. We were able to enroll 40 faculty across the MENA region. And we ended up filling it very quickly. And we were funded to do a second section. So I think opportunities like that certainly exist and we should explore.
I just have a quick question while I have the opportunity. You mentioned, I don't know if it was today or in a previous conversation, that international education administrators are, quote, agnostic about location, right?
Yes.
That you're looking to establish ties and relationships with people and institutions from countries all around the world. Let's say that there's an individual at an institution who is interested in attempting to establish either a formal or informal relationship with an Iranian university. What would be some of the most effective points for that faculty member to make when they're in the office of their campus international officer? What would be, assuming they may not know much about Iran or may even have a range of misperceptions about the country and people, what would the best way be to approach a conversation like that?
Yeah, that's such a great question, and I would give advice I would give this advice no matter where the person was from, honestly, in that institutions of higher education in the United States are very mission oriented, and internationalization is not often the end; it's a means to an end. So, if we have been and continue to want to be the preeminent institution in entrepreneurship education at Babson College, I can't go to the trustees and president and say, let's make internationalization our end. But I can articulate as a senior international officer that without an internationalization strategy, we will never be the preeminent institution in entrepreneurship education, right? And so that person needs to understand that mission and understand in what ways does our engagement with their institution in Iran enhance the mission. So one of our mission, for example, is that we want to create access to entrepreneurship education and develop entrepreneurial leaders everywhere, both from a geographical context, but the ability for our students to be able to navigate intercultural differences and different nuances in different parts of the world. That gives me a mandate as the Dean of Global Education to create opportunities for students to really go out and understand how the world works, perhaps through the lens of entrepreneurship education. And so if they can bring me a proposal that says, you know, I can help you achieve that goal, and perhaps it generates some revenue, or it meets other objectives, or it creates additional access, or it makes a more diverse set of students access your curriculum, then I'm listening. Then I want to actually accommodate that conversation, right? And I think that's true no matter what institution you're talking to in the US context. It needs to be mission focused. So understanding what that institution's goals and objectives are and seeing how your objectives can fit within and further their goals would be the way I would say partnerships work. And of course, if you have institutional actors, key stakeholders that have an affinity with your nation, in this case, Iran, it always helps, right?
Thank you very much for that. Dr. Bakhtiari?
Oh, you're muted, I think.
So I think one of the institutional challenges that you went over is also OFAC, right? And in your experience of past decade, how do you see OFAC has also become more of a challenge? Let's put it this way, that today, when you talk to your president, when you talk to senior officials of the universities, the first thing that comes to their mind is not a question of the value of the work, is the question of legality of it. So how do you approach the institutions who are concerned and they want some kind of a legal clarity here to also get assurances that with OFAC they can work to get this?
Yeah, that's such a good point, that most international officers will rely on general counsel to guide them on these internationalization plans, MOUs, engagement. And the fact that Iran is sanctioned and therefore engagement with an Iranian institution, which may require some transaction, creates this red flag that, again, as I mentioned in that IUPUI case, it's easier to just move on and do something else because the institutional actors are going to have these red flags and say no. Where I do think that has been a huge impediment. I do think that organizations like Baskerville Institute, who have worked diligently to get licenses where we can actually engage with Iranians in Iran through virtual education, create a platform, but also a pathway for institutions to imagine, right? IUPUI did that, and I think other institutions do that. But again, I go back to, because that is an uphill battle and it's lengthy, it requires significant resilience on the part of the actors at the institutional level. If that were not in place, if education or higher education had an exemption at large of the sanctions, I think that would open the doors very quickly to much more collaboration. There are still many Iranian, or I should say US Americans, who have fond memories of visiting Iran as educators, have engaging with Iranian students and Iranian faculty. And so there is this strong desire to go back to that in some sense, but they also see these institutional and political realities.
Well, we can take a couple of more questions, Matt, and then we kind of wrap it up with some concluded remarks. And really thank you, Dr. Reza, for bringing so much information for everyone.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I would just ask, you did such a great job laying out the timeline of U.S.-Iran educational cooperation, with key dates, say in the late 40s with the creation of the Binational Educational Commission or the various arrangements after 1953. You mentioned the relationship between the USAID program and Pahlavi University, which began in the 1960s. We see the large expansion of the number of Iranian students in the US in the 1970s, peaking in 79, 80, and then the post-revolutionary dip. You tracked all that so well for us. I guess I'm just wondering, since 1979, what are some of the major milestones in the history of international education more broadly, even as it may not relate to Iran directly, because so many of us in this webinar may be familiar with, kind of some of the Iran-specific milestones, but to your mind, what are some of the major developments in the field, institutionally or otherwise, in the last 50 years, 40 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, if we want to focus a little bit on the push-pull factors, Professor Shannon, I think, for easily 5 decades, the U.S. had such a strong pull factor that there were no other nations that were pulling students from across the globe the way that the U.S. was. And the U.S. benefited from that in so many ways. If we look at Nobel laureates, other scientific accomplishments, was all done through that pull of brains coming into the United States, engaging in this robust environment. And beginning in, I would say, post 9/11, 2001, we see a sharp turn in 2 things. One is other nations beginning to develop national policies on creating pull factors for international students from across the globe, while the U.S. increasingly creating an unwelcoming environment through a number of factors. Visas would be one, and then the post-completion work authorization limits, right? H1 limitations on the H1B work visa, and just, you can name it, gun violence, other factors have meant that families, coupled, by the way, by a really sharp increase in tuition, right? So that has meant that nations like Canada, UK, and until recently, until the pandemic era, even China was seeing exponential growth in international students. And while the US still had, in raw numbers, the largest numbers, our share of international students across the globe was decreasing, right? So we see that. On the other hand, I do think, as I mentioned, the education abroad, outbound mobility of US students has increased steadily, minus the pandemic. To a large extent, we are not seeing students study abroad for long-term, semester, year-long. We are seeing them do more and more. The increase is all in these short-term programs that are faculty-led for these short instances. That has implications. The research shows perhaps that it's not as fruitful, it's not as impactful, but it is very much what we might call market-driven, right? That's where the students are going towards, and that's what institutions are providing. And then we are seeing this, I think, really level of comfort with digital or online learning increase. And I do think that in the foreseeable future, we're going to see significant growth for intercultural and international learning through these modes. Again, to reinforce one of the questions, one of the participants' message that it is not a replacement of immersion program, but it is an enhancement of that, especially given that if we look at today's US higher education landscape, only a fraction of US students ever get to go abroad. It's, if we look at the entire tertiary education model, I would venture this well under 10%. So that means that, at a place like Babson, like I said, we benefit from internationalization. My undergraduates, something like 65% will have had a study abroad experience by the time they graduate. While on a national level, you have many, over 90% perhaps, that are not accessing any kind of education abroad or international learning in that context. And that has implications for our future, for competitiveness, for ability to work in a very globalized world. And we need to address that. And I think virtual global learning is one of the many solutions towards that.
Thank you very much for that very comprehensive answer. We have just a few more, maybe two more questions and a comment that I'm seeing right now. David Woodward is asking about ways that American and Iranian scholars can stay in touch with technology. He mentions LinkedIn as an effective tool, but if perhaps there are other ways that informal relationships between students and scholars can be sustained. And there is also a question from Lawrence Wilkerson about how during the Obama administration, there were general exemptions from OFAC with respect to Cuba and environmental work, dealing with coral reefs, sea rise, and other such issues. Do you foresee any possibility that such a general exemption for education could be a possibility for Iran?
Yeah, on the second one, I would think that it would require significant advocacy on the part of the different actors, higher education community, perhaps through NAFSA, ACE, obviously National Iranian-American Council, others, to really push for such a change. It's not going to come from the individual faculty and learners and scholars. Potentially, but we would have to actually have a coalition that works on that, right? And then on the first one, I want to make sure, can you repeat that? It was requesting, can you repeat what the question was?
You're just asking about various ways that American and Iranian
David was asking. I think, of course, LinkedIn is fine. The challenge is it becomes a very one-on-one as opposed to a cohorted experience, which is why I go to this multilateral approach of joining organizations where both multiple nationalities are working towards something in a discipline where we can create engagement. And I think those are where places where you build opportunities, friendships, and spark interest in possible future opportunities. If I ask the average faculty on my campus, why did you decide to lead a cohort of students to X place? They often talk about an association they belong to, an organization they belong to, where they met somebody who's become a friend, who's become a mentor perhaps over years. And that's why I'm interested in XYZ place, and it will illuminate a topic for our students. And as I mentioned, that's where I'm agnostic, saying absolutely, as long as there's safety, security, and a possibility, I want you to lead students to have that global learning experience. But oftentimes those associations, organizations, and I think that's where we need to explore more. Where do Iranian scholars and practitioners, administrators, in what spaces do they hang out where they can overlap with also US Americans? And those suggestions might be some of them. And of course, other discipline-specific organizations could be others.
Dr. Bakhtiari, do you have any
Well,
additional
I
questions?
think we have kind of reaching the end of our webinar program. I want to pass also the comments and compliments of many of our audience members to you, Dr. Reza, for giving us such a comprehensive briefing. Also, the fact that there's so much work to be done on this area. And as much as you emphasize, so these kind of briefings should continue. We should educate our international education leaders about the potential for friendship that you talked about and the history. So I want to really thank you for taking time to preparing that PowerPoints and presentations, and we'll be uploading a recording of this session for others to see. And also I want to thank Matt, who himself is a scholar of American Iranian history with a focus on international education. So it was great to bring all of you together, and Matt will make his final remarks for our webinar.
Thank you.
Just want to thank you, Dr. Reza, for your presentation as well. There's so much that I've learned, and we had such an engaging audience with some great questions, and perhaps someday you'll be able to put this lecture into a book about educational ties between the US and Iran.
Yes, yes. But thank you so much. Please join us for our next event, which is as exciting as this one, when we focus on the role of wrestling, the sport, the beloved sport of Iranians, and how much that sport has helped to build bridges of friendship between Americans and Iranians. So we look forward to having you in our next lecture, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.